Books on Tape presents Mao, The Unknown Story by Chang and John Halliday. Read by Robertson Dean. Part 1. Lukewarm Believer. Chapter 1. On the Cusp from Ancient to Modern. 1893 to 1911. Age 1 to 17. Mao Zedong, who for decades held absolute power over the lives of 1/4 of the world's population, was responsible for well over 70 million deaths in peacetime, more than any other 20th century leader. He was born into a peasant family in a valley called Shaoshan in the province of Hunan, in the heartland of China. The date was 26 December 1893. His ancestors had lived in the valley for 500 years. This was a world of ancient beauty, a temperate, humid region whose misty, undulating hills had been populated ever since the Neolithic age. Buddhist temples dating from the Tang dynasty, AD 618 to 906, when Buddhism first came here, were still in use. Forests where nearly 300 species of trees grew, including maples, camphor, metasequoia, and the rare ginkgo, covered the area and sheltered the tigers, leopards, and boar that still roamed the hills. The last tiger was killed in 1957. These hills, with neither roads nor navigable rivers, detached the village from the world at large. Even as late as the early 20th century, an event as momentous as the death of the emperor in 1908 did not percolate this far, and Mao found out only 2 years afterward, when he left Shaoshan. The valley of Shaoshan measures about 5 by 3.5 kilometers. The 600-odd families who lived there grew rice, tea, and bamboo, harnessing buffalo to plow the rice paddies. Daily life revolved around these age-old activities. Mao's father, Chang, was born in 1870. At the age of 10, he was engaged to a girl of 13 from a village about 10 kilometers away, beyond a pass called Tiger Resting Pass, where tigers used to sun themselves. This short distance was long enough in those years for the two villages to speak dialects that were almost mutually unintelligible. Being merely a girl, Mao's mother did not receive a name. As the 7th girl born in the Wen clan, she was just 7th Sister Wen. In accordance with centuries of custom, her feet had been crushed and bound to produce the so-called 3-inch golden lilies that epitomized beauty at the time. Her engagement to Mao's father followed time-honored customs. It was arranged by their parents and was based on a practical consideration. The tomb of one of her grandfathers was in Shaoshan, and it had to be tended regularly with elaborate rituals, so having a relative there would prove useful. 7th Sister Wen moved in with the Maos upon betrothal and was married at the age of 18 in 1885, when Chang was 15. Shortly after the wedding, Chang went off to be a soldier to earn money to pay off family debts, which he was able to do after several years. Chinese peasants were not serfs, but free farmers, and joining the army for purely financial reasons was an established practice. Luckily, he was not involved in any wars. Instead, he caught a glimpse of the world and picked up some business ideas. Unlike most of the villagers, Chang could read and write well enough to keep accounts. After his return, he raised pigs and processed grain into top-quality rice to sell at a nearby market town. He bought back the land his father had pawned, then bought more land, and became one of the richest men in the village. Though relatively well off, Chang remained extremely hard-working and thrifty all his life. The family house consisted of half a dozen rooms, which occupied one wing of a large thatched property. Eventually, Chang replaced the thatch with tiles, a major improvement, but left the mud floor and mud walls. The windows had no glass, still a rare luxury, and were just square openings with wooden bars, blocked off at night by wooden boards. The temperature hardly ever fell below freezing. The furniture was simple: wooden beds, bare wooden tables and benches. It was in one of these rather Spartan rooms, under a pale blue homespun cotton quilt, inside a blue mosquito net, that Mao was born. Mao was the 3rd son, but the first to survive beyond infancy. His Buddhist mother became even more devout to encourage Buddha to protect him. Mao was given the two-part name Tse-tung. Tse, which means to shine on, was the name given to all his generation, as preordained when the clan chronicle was first written in the 18th century. Tung means the east, so his full given name meant to shine on the east. When two more boys were born, in 1896 and 1905, they were given the names Tse-min, min means the people, and Tse-tan. Tan possibly referred to the local region, Jiangtan. These names reflected the inveterate aspiration of Chinese peasants for their sons to do well, and the expectation that they could. High positions were open to all through education, which for centuries meant studying Confucian classics. Excellence would enable young men of any background to pass imperial examinations and become mandarins, all the way up to becoming prime minister. Officialdom was the definition of achievement, and the names given to Mao and his brothers expressed the hopes placed on them. But a grand name was also onerous and potentially tempted fate, so most children were given a pet name that was either lowly or tough, or both. Mao's was the Boy of Stone, Shishanyazi. For this second baptism, his mother took him to a rock about 8 feet high, which was reputed to be enchanted, as there was a spring underneath. After Mao performed obeisance and kowtows, he was considered adopted by the rock. Mao was very fond of this name, and continued to use it as an adult. In 1959, when he returned to Shaoshan and met the villagers for the first and only time as supreme leader of China, he began the dinner for them with a quip. "So everyone is here, except my stone mother. Shall we wait for her?" Mao loved his real mother, with an intensity he showed towards no one else. She was a gentle and tolerant person, who, as he remembered, never raised her voice to him. From her came his full face, sensual lips, and a calm self-possession in the eyes. Mao would talk about his mother with emotion all his life. It was in her footsteps that he became a Buddhist as a child. Years later he told his staff, "I worshipped my mother. Wherever my mother went, I would follow, going to temple fairs, burning incense and paper money, doing obeisance to Buddha. Because my mother believed in Buddha, so did I." But he gave up Buddhism in his mid-teens. Mao had a carefree childhood. Until he was 8, he lived with his mother's family, the Wens, in their village, as his mother preferred to live with her own family. There his maternal grandmother doted on him. His 2 uncles and their wives treated him like their own son, and one of them became his adopted father, the Chinese equivalent to godfather. Mao did a little light farm work, gathering fodder for pigs and taking the buffaloes out for a stroll in the tea-oil camellia groves, by a pond shaded by banana leaves. In later years, he would reminisce with fondness about this idyllic time. He started learning to read while his aunts spun and sewed under an oil lamp. Mao only came back to live in Shaoshan in spring 1902, at the age of 8, to receive an education, which took the form of study in a tutor's home. Confucian classics, which made up most of the curriculum, were beyond the understanding of children and had to be learnt by heart. Mao was blessed with an exceptional memory and did well. His fellow pupils remembered a diligent boy who managed not only to recite, but also to write by rote these difficult texts. He also gained a foundation in Chinese language and history, and began to learn to write good prose, calligraphy, and poetry, as writing poems was an essential part of a Confucian education. Reading became a passion. Peasants generally turned in at sunset to save on oil for lamps, but Mao would read deep into the night, with an oil lamp standing on a bench outside his mosquito net. Years later, when he was supreme ruler of China, half of his huge bed would be piled a foot high with Chinese classics, and he littered his speeches and writings with historical references. But his poems lost flair. Mao clashed frequently with his tutors. He ran away from his first school at the age of 10, claiming that the teacher was a martinet. He was expelled from, or was asked to leave, at least 3 schools for being headstrong and disobedient. His mother indulged him, but his father was not pleased. and Mao's hopping from tutor to tutor was just one source of tension between father and son. Chang paid for Mao's education, hoping that his son could at least help keep the family accounts, but Mao disliked the task. All his life, he was vague about figures and hopeless at economics. Nor did he take kindly to hard physical labor. He shunned it as soon as his peasant days were over. Chang could not stand Mao being idle. Having spent every minute of his waking hours working, he expected his son to do the same and would strike him when he did not comply. Mao hated his father. In 1968, when he was taking revenge on his political foes on a vast scale, he told their tormentors that he would have liked his father to be treated just as brutally. "My father was bad. If he were alive today, he should be jet-planed." This was an agonizing position where the subject's arms were wrenched behind his back and his head forced down. Mao was not a mere victim of his father. He fought back and was often the victor. He would tell his father that the father, being older, should do more manual labor than he, the younger, which was an unthinkably insolent argument by Chinese standards. One day, according to Mao, father and son had a row in front of guests. "My father scolded me before them, calling me lazy and useless. This infuriated me. I called him names and left the house. My father pursued me, cursing as well as commanding me to come back. I reached the edge of a pond and threatened to jump in if he came any nearer. My father backed down." Once, as Mao was retelling the story, he laughed and added an observation. "Old men like him didn't want to lose their sons. This is their weakness. I attacked at their weak point, and I won." Money was the only weapon Mao's father possessed. After Mao was expelled by tutor number 4 in 1907, his father stopped paying his son's tuition fees, and the 13-year-old boy had to become a full-time peasant. But he soon found a way to get himself out of farm work and back into the world of books. Chang was keen for his son to get married, so that he would be tied down and behave responsibly. His niece was at just the right age for a wife, 4 years older than Mao, who agreed to his father's plan and resumed schooling after the marriage. The marriage took place in 1908, when Mao was 14 and his bride 18. Her family name was Luo. She herself had no proper name, and was just called Woman Luo. The only time Mao is known to have mentioned her was to the American journalist Edgar Snow in 1936, when Mao was strikingly dismissive, exaggerating the difference in their ages. "When I was 14, my parents married me to a girl of 20, but I never lived with her. I do not consider her my wife, and have given little thought to her." He gave no hint that she was not still alive. In fact, Woman Luo had died in 1910, just over a year into their marriage. Mao's early marriage turned him into a fierce opponent of arranged marriages. 9 years later, he wrote a seething article against the practice. "In families in the West, parents acknowledge the free will of their children, but in China, orders from the parents are not at all compatible with the will of the children. This is a kind of indirect rape. Chinese parents are all the time indirectly raping their children." As soon as his wife died, the 16-year-old widower demanded to leave Shaoshan. His father wanted to apprentice him to a rice store in the county town, but Mao had set his eye on a modern school about 25 kilometers away. He had learned that the imperial examinations had been abolished. Instead, there were modern schools now, teaching subjects like science, world history and geography, and foreign languages. It was these schools that would open the door out of a peasant's life for many like him. In the latter 19th century, China had embarked on a dramatic social transformation. The Manchu dynasty that had ruled since 1644 was moving from the ancient to the modern. The shift was prompted by a series of abysmal defeats at the hands of European powers and Japan, beginning with the loss to Britain in the Opium War of 1839-42, as the powers came knocking on China's closed door. From the Manchu court to intellectuals, nearly everyone agreed that the country must change if it wanted to survive. A host of fundamental reforms was introduced, one of which was to install an entirely new educational system. Railways began to be built. Modern industries and commerce were given top priority. Political organizations were permitted. Newspapers were published for the first time. Students were sent abroad to study science. Mandarins dispatched to learn democracy and parliamentary systems. In 1908, the court announced a program to become a constitutional monarchy in 9 years' time. Mao's province, Hunan, which had some 30 million inhabitants, became one of the most liberal and exciting places in China. Though landlocked, it was linked by navigable rivers to the coast, and in 1904, its capital, Chang became an open trading port. Large numbers of foreign traders and missionaries arrived, bringing Western ways and institutions. By the time Mao heard about modern schools, there were over 100 of them, more than in any other part of China, and including many for women. One was located near Mao, Eastern Hill, in the county of the Wens, his mother's family. The fees and accommodations were quite high, but Mao got the Wens and other relatives to lobby his father, who stumped up the cost for 5 months. The wife of one of his Wen cousins replaced Mao's old blue homespun mosquito net with a white machine-made muslin one, in keeping with the school's modernity. The school was an eye-opener for Mao. Lessons included physical training, music, and English, and among the reading materials were potted biographies of Napoleon, Wellington, Peter the Great, Rousseau, and Lincoln. Mao heard about America and Europe for the first time, and laid eyes on a man who had been abroad, a teacher who had studied in Japan, who was given the nickname the False Foreign Devil by his pupils. Decades later, Mao could still remember a Japanese song he taught them, celebrating Japan's stunning military victory over Russia in 1905. Mao was only in Eastern Hill for a few months, but this was enough for him to find a new opening. In the provincial capital, Changsha, there was a school specially set up for young people from the Wens County, and Mao persuaded a teacher to enroll him, even though he was, strictly speaking, not from the county. In spring 1911, he arrived at Changsha, feeling, in his own words, exceedingly excited. At 17, he said goodbye forever to the life of a peasant. Mao claimed later that when he was a boy in Shaoshan, he had been stirred by concern for poor peasants. There is no evidence for this. He said he had been influenced while still in Shaoshan by a certain Pang, the millstone maker, who had been arrested and beheaded after leading a local peasant revolt. But an exhaustive search by party historians for this hero has failed to turn up any trace of him. There is no sign that Mao derived from his peasant roots any social concerns, much less that he was motivated by a sense of injustice. In a contemporary document, the diary of Mao's teacher, Professor Yang Changqi, wrote on 5 April 1915, "My student Mao Zedong said that his clan are mostly peasants, and it is easy for them to get rich." Mao evinced no particular sympathy for peasants. Up to the end of 1925, when he was in his early 30s, and 5 years after he had become a communist, Mao made only a few references to peasants in all his known writings and conversations. They did crop up in a letter of August 1917, but far from expressing sympathy, Mao said he was bowled over by the way a commander called Zheng Kuofan had finished off the biggest peasant uprising in Chinese history, the Taiping Rebellion of 1850-64. 2 years later, in July 1919, Mao wrote an essay about people from different walks of life, so peasants were inevitably mentioned, but his list of questions was very general, and his tone unmistakably neutral. There was a remarkable absence of emotion when he mentioned peasants, compared with the passion he voiced about students, whose life he described as a sea of bitterness. In a comprehensive list for research he drew up in September that year, containing no fewer than 71 items, only one heading, the 10th, was about labor. The single one out of its 15 subheads that mentioned peasants did so only as the question of laboring farmers intervening in politics. From late 1920, when he entered the communist orbit, Mao began to use expressions like workers and peasants, and proletariat, but they remained mere phrases, part of an obligatory vocabulary. Decades later, Mao talked about how, as a young man in Shaoshan, he cared about people starving. The record shows no such concern. In 1921, Mao was in Changsha during a famine. A friend of his wrote in his diary, "There are many beggars, must be over 100 a day. Most look like skeletons wrapped in yellow skin, as if they could be blown over by a whiff of wind. I heard that so many people who had come here to escape famine in their own regions had died, that those who have been giving away planks of wood to make coffins can no longer afford to do so." There is no mention of this event in Mao's writings at the time, and no sign that he gave any thought to this issue at all. Mao's peasant background did not imbue him with idealism about improving the lot of Chinese peasants. Chapter 2. Becoming a Communist. 1911 to 1920, age 17 to 26. Mao arrived in Changsha in spring 1911, on the eve of the Republican Revolution that was to end over 2,000 years of imperial rule. Though Changsha seemed just like a medieval town to the British philosopher Bertrand Russell a decade later, with narrow streets, no traffic possible except sedan chairs and rickshaws, it was not merely in touch with new ideas and trends, it seethed with Republican activity. The Manchu court had promised a constitutional monarchy, but the Republicans were dedicated to getting rid of the Manchus entirely. To them, Manchu rule was foreign domination, as the Manchus were not Han Chinese, the ethnic group that formed the bulk, about 94% of the population. The Republicans lit sparks through newspapers and magazines that had sprung up all over China in the previous decade, and through the entirely new practice of public debates, in what had hitherto been an almost totally private society. They formed organizations and launched several unsuccessful armed uprisings. Mao quickly caught up on the issues through newspapers, which he read for the first time now at the age of 17, the start of a lifelong addiction. He wrote his first, rather confused, political essay, expressing Republican views, and pasted it up on a wall at his school, in line with the latest trend. Like many other students in the school, he cut off his pigtail, which, as a Manchu custom, was the most obvious symbol of imperial rule. With a friend, he then ambushed a dozen others and forcibly removed their queues with scissors. That summer, extremely hot and humid as usual in Changsha, students debated feverishly about how to overthrow the emperor. One day, in the middle of an impassioned discussion, a young man suddenly tore off his long scholar's gown, threw it on the ground, and yelled, "Let's do some martial exercises and be prepared for war against the emperor." In October, an armed uprising in neighboring Hubei province heralded the Republican Revolution. The Manchu dynasty that had ruled China for over 260 years crumbled, and a republic was declared on 1 January 1912. The child emperor, Pu Yi, abdicated the following month. Yuan Shikai, military chief of the country, became the president, succeeding the interim provisional president, Sun Yat-sen. The provinces were controlled by army strongmen with allegiance to Yuan. When Yuan died in 1916, the central government in Peking weakened, and power fragmented to the provincial chiefs, who became semi-independent warlords. Over the following decade, they fought spasmodic wars, which disrupted civilian life in combat zones. But otherwise, the warlords left most people relatively unaffected. Indeed, the rather loosely governed fledgling republic opened up all sorts of career opportunities. The young Mao faced a dazzling range of choices: industry, commerce, law, administration, education, journalism, culture, the military. He first enlisted in one of the Republican armies, but left within months, as he did not like the drilling or chores, like carrying water for cooking, which he hired a water vendor to do for him. He decided to go back to school and scanned the array of advertisements in the papers. The ads, colorful and rather sophisticated, were also a new thing in China. 6 institutions drew his attention, including a police college, a law college, and a school that specialized in making soap. He picked a general high school and stayed for 6 months before boredom drove him out to study by himself in the provincial library. At last, Mao found something he loved doing. He spent all day there, devouring new books, including translations of Western writings. He said later that he was like a buffalo charging into a vegetable garden and just gobbling down everything that grew. This reading helped free his mind of traditional constraints. But his father threatened to cut him off unless he got into a proper school, so Mao entered a teacher training college. It required no tuition fees and offered cheap board and lodging, like other such colleges in those days, as part of China's efforts to promote education. This was spring 1913, and Mao was 19. The college embodied the open-mindedness of the time. Even its building was European style, with Romanesque arches and a wide columned porch, and was suitably called Yanglu, foreign building. The classrooms had smart wooden floors and glass windows. The students were exposed to all sorts of new ideas and encouraged to think freely and organize study groups. They turned out publications about anarchism, nationalism, and Marxism, and for a while a portrait of Marx hung in the auditorium. Mao had earlier come across the word socialism in a newspaper. Now he encountered communism for the first time. It was a period of real "let 100 flowers bloom," a phrase Mao invoked for a moment under his own rule later, but without allowing a tiny fraction of the freedom he himself had enjoyed as a young man. Mao was not a loner, and, like students the world over, he and his friends talked long and hard. The college was situated near the Chang River, the biggest river in Hunan. Swimming in the Jiang inspired Mao to write a rather flamboyant poem in 1917. In the evenings, the friends would go for long walks along its banks, enjoying the sight of junks gliding by the Island of Oranges, which was covered with orchards of orange trees. On summer evenings, they climbed the hill behind the school and sat arguing deep into the night on the grass where crickets crooned and glowworms twinkled, ignoring the summons of the bugle to bed. Mao and his friends also traveled. There was complete freedom of movement and no need for identity papers. During the summer vacation of 1917, Mao and a friend wandered round the countryside for a month, earning food and shelter from peasants by doing calligraphy to decorate their front doors. On another occasion, Mao and 2 fellow students walked along a newly built railway, and when dusk descended, knocked on the door of a hilltop monastery overlooking the Jiang River. The monks allowed them to stay the night. After dinner, the friends followed the stone steps down to the river for a swim, and then sat on the sandy bank and expounded their views to the lapping of the waves. The guest room had a veranda, and the friends went on talking in the quiet of the night. One was moved by the loveliness of the still night, and said he wanted to become a monk. In this and other conversations, Mao poured scorn on his fellow Chinese. "The nature of the people of the country is inertia," he said. "They worship hypocrisy, are content with being slaves and narrow-minded." This was a common enough sentiment among the educated at the time, when people were casting around for explanations for why China had been so easily defeated by foreign powers and was trailing so badly in the modern world. But what Mao said next was uncommon extremism. Mr. Mao also proposed burning all the collections of prose and poetry after the Tang and Sung dynasties in one go, a friend wrote in his diary. This is the first known occasion when Mao mentioned one theme that was to typify his rule, the destruction of Chinese culture. When he first said it in that moonlit monastery, it had not sounded totally outlandish. At that time of unprecedented personal and intellectual freedom, the freest moment in Chinese history, everything that had been taken for granted was questioned, and what had been viewed as wrong proclaimed as right. Should there be countries, families, marriage, private property? Nothing was too outrageous, too shocking, or unsayable. It was in this environment that Mao's views on morals took shape. In the winter of 1917-18, still a student as he turned 24, he wrote extensive commentaries on a book called A System of Ethics by a minor late 19th century German philosopher, Friedrich Paulsen. In these notes, Mao expressed the central elements in his own character, which stayed consistent for the remaining 6 decades of his life and defined his rule. Mao's attitude to morality consisted of one core, the self. I above everything else. I do not agree with the view that to be moral, the motive of one's action has to be benefiting others. Morality does not have to be defined in relation to others. People like me want to satisfy our hearts to the full, and in doing so, we automatically have the most valuable moral codes. Of course there are people and objects in the world, but they are all there only for me. Mao shunned all constraints of responsibility and duty. People like me only have a duty to ourselves. We have no duty to other people. I am responsible only for the reality that I know, he wrote, and absolutely not responsible for anything else. I don't know about the past. I don't know about the future. They have nothing to do with the reality of my own self. He explicitly rejected any responsibility towards future generations. Some say one has a responsibility for history. I don't believe it. I am only concerned about developing myself. I have my desire and act on it. I am responsible to no one. Mao did not believe in anything unless he could benefit from it personally. A good name after death, he said, cannot bring me any joy because it belongs to the future and not to my own reality. People like me are not building achievements to leave for future generations. Mao did not care what he left behind. He argued that conscience could go to hell if it was in conflict with his impulses. These two should be one and the same. All our actions are driven by impulse, and the conscience that is wise goes along with this in every instance. Sometimes conscience restrains impulses, such as overeating or overindulgence in sex. But conscience is only there to restrain, not oppose, and the restraint is for better completion of the impulse. As conscience always implies some concern for other people, and is not a corollary of hedonism, Mao was rejecting the concept. His view was, I do not think these commands like do not kill, do not steal, and do not slander have to do with conscience. I think they are only out of self-interest, for self-preservation. All considerations must be purely calculation for oneself, and absolutely not for obeying external ethical codes or for so-called feelings of responsibility. Absolute selfishness and irresponsibility lay at the heart of Mao's outlook. These attributes he held to be reserved for great heroes, a group to which he appointed himself. For this elite, he said, everything outside their nature, such as restrictions and constraints, must be swept away by the great strength in their nature. When great heroes give full play to their impulses, they are magnificently powerful, stormy, and invincible. Their power is like a hurricane arising from a deep gorge, and, like a sex maniac on heat and prowling for a lover, there is no way to stop them. The other central element in his character, which Mao spelt out now, was the joy he took in upheaval and destruction. Giant wars, he wrote, will last as long as heaven and earth, and will never become extinct. The ideal of a world of great equality and harmony, Datong, Confucian ideal society, is mistaken. This was not just the prediction that a pessimist might make. It was Mao's desideratum, which he asserted was what the population at large wished. Long-lasting peace, he claimed, is unendurable to human beings, and tidal waves of disturbance have to be created in this state of peace. When we look at history, we adore the times of war, when dramas happened one after another, which make reading about them great fun. When we get to the periods of peace and prosperity, we are bored. Human nature loves sudden, swift changes. Mao simply collapsed the distinction between reading about stirring events and actually living through cataclysm. He ignored the fact that, for the overwhelming majority, war meant misery. He even articulated a cavalier attitude towards death. Human beings are endowed with the sense of curiosity. Why should we treat death differently? Don't we want to experience strange things? Death is the strangest thing, which you will never experience if you go on living. Some are afraid of it because the change comes too drastically. But I think this is the most wonderful thing. Where else in this world can we find such a fantastic and drastic change? Using a very royal we, Mao went on. We love sailing on a sea of upheavals. To go from life to death is to experience the greatest upheaval. Isn't it magnificent? This might at first seem surreal, but when later tens of millions of Chinese were starved to death under his rule, Mao told his inner ruling circle it did not matter if people died, and even that death was to be celebrated. As so often, he applied his attitude only to other people, not to himself. Throughout his own life he was obsessed with finding ways to thwart death, doing everything he could to perfect his security and enhance his medical care. When he came to the question, how do we change China, Mao laid the utmost emphasis on destruction. The country must be destroyed and then reformed. He extended this line not just to China, but to the whole world, and even the universe. This applies to the country, to the nation, and to mankind. The destruction of the universe is the same. People like me long for its destruction, because when the old universe is destroyed, a new universe will be formed. Isn't that better? These views, worded so clearly at the age of 24, remained at the core of Mao's thinking throughout his life. In 1918, he had little prospect of putting them into practice, and they had no impact, though he seems to have been someone who made an impression. His teacher, Chang wrote of him in his diary of 5 April 1915, "My student Mao Zedong said that his father was a peasant and is now turning into a merchant. And yet he, Mao, is so fine and outstanding, really hard to come by. As peasant stock often produces extraordinary talents, I encouraged him." But Mao did not appear to have leadership qualities. Another teacher of his said later that he showed no special talent for leadership at school. When he tried to form a sort of club and put up notices, only a few people turned up, and it did not come to anything. When a dozen friends formed a New People's Study Society in April 1918, Mao was not elected its leader. He even found it hard to get a job after he graduated from the teacher training college in June 1918. At the time, it was common for young graduates to aspire to go abroad to study. For those whose families could not afford to support them, as in Mao's case, there was a scheme to go to France on a work and study program. France needed manpower after losing so many young men in the First World War. One of the jobs Chinese laborers had been brought in to do was to remove corpses from the battlefields. Some of Mao's friends went to France. Mao did not. The prospect of physical labor put him off. And another factor seems to have played a part, the requirement to learn French. Mao was no good at languages, and all his life spoke only his own local dialect, and not even the Putonghua, common speech, that his own regime made its official language. In 1920, when going to Russia was in vogue, and Mao fancied going, he told a girlfriend, "My mind is filled with happiness and hope," at the thought. He was deterred by having to learn Russian. He made a stab at it, taking lessons from a Russian émigré and agent, Sergei Polivoy. But, according to Polivoy, the other students teased Mao when he could not even master the alphabet, and he left in a huff. Unlike many of his radical contemporaries, including most of the future Chinese Communist leaders, Mao went to neither France nor Russia. Instead, after leaving the college, Mao borrowed some money and set out for Peking, the capital, to try his luck. Peking in 1918 was one of the most beautiful cities in the world, where, in front of magnificent palaces, camels strolled in the streets. The imperial gardens, near where Mao took lodgings, had just been opened to the public. When winter came, he and his friends, all Southerners who had seldom seen snow or ice, would marvel at the frozen lakes encircled by drooping willows heavy with icicles and wide-open winter plums. But life in the capital was harsh. The great freedom and opportunities that modernization had introduced to China had brought little material advantage, and much of the country was still extremely poor. Mao stayed with 7 other friends in 3 tiny rooms. 4 of them squeezed onto one Chang, a heated brick bed, under a single quilt, packed so tight that when one of them needed to turn, he had to warn the men on either side. Between the 8 of them, they had only 2 coats, and had to take turns going out. As there was heating in the library, Mao went there to read in the evenings. Mao got nowhere in Peking. For a while he found work as a junior librarian, earning 8 yuan a month, a living wage. One of his jobs was to record the names of people who came to read the newspapers, many of whom he recognized as leading intellectuals, but he made no great impression, and they paid him no attention. Mao felt snubbed, and he bore his grudges hard. He claimed later that, "Most of them did not treat me like a human being." Less than 6 months after arriving, he left, so broke that he had to borrow money to travel home in stages. He returned to Changsha in April 1919 via Shanghai, where he saw his friends off to France. He had looked in from the outside at the intellectual and political life of cosmopolitan big cities, and now had to settle for a lowly job as a part-time history teacher in a primary school back in his home province. Mao did not present himself as a model teacher. He was unkempt and never seemed to change his clothes. His pupils remembered him disheveled, with holes in his socks, wearing homemade cotton shoes ready to fall apart. But at least he observed basic proprieties. 2 years later, when he was teaching in another establishment, people complained about him being naked from the waist up. When asked to dress more decently, Mao retorted, "There wouldn't be anything scandalous if I was stark naked. Consider yourself lucky I'm not completely naked." Mao had returned to Changsha at a pivotal historical moment. At the time, there were a number of enclaves in China leased by foreign powers. These operated outside Chinese jurisdiction, with foreign gunboats often nearby to protect expatriates. Newly awakened public opinion in China demanded that these virtual mini-colonies be handed back. And yet, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which drew up the post-First World War settlement, and in which a Chinese delegation took part, allowed Japan to stay on in territory in Shandong, which Japan had seized from Germany during the war. This infuriated nationalist sentiment. On 4 May 1919, for the first time in history, a big street demonstration took place in Peking, denouncing the government for selling out and protesting against the Japanese holding on to Chinese territory. The movement ripped across China. Japanese goods were burned in cities and towns, and shops that sold them were attacked. Many Chinese were disappointed that a Republican government had not managed to obtain a better deal from foreign powers than its Manchu predecessor. The sentiment grew that something more radical must be done. In Changsha, where there were now so many foreign interests that Japan, the U.S., and Britain had opened consulates there, a militant student union was formed, which included teachers. Mao was actively involved as the editor of its magazine, the Jiang River Review. In the first number, he declared his radical views. "We must now doubt what we dared not doubt, employ methods we dared not employ." It was a shoestring operation. Mao not only had to write most of the articles himself, in stifling heat, while bedbugs raced over the pile of soft-bound Chinese classics that formed his pillow, he had to sell the review at street corners. Only 5 issues were published. Mao continued to write occasional pieces in other journals. Among his output were 10 articles dealing with women and the family. Mao was an advocate of women's independence, free choice in marriage, and equality with men, views not uncommon among the radicals. These outpourings seem to have been inspired by the death on 5 October 1919 of his mother, whom he loved. He had been sending her prescriptions for her ailments, diphtheria and a lymph node condition, and had arranged for her to be brought to Changsha for treatment. There, in spring that year, she had her first and only photograph taken at the age of 52, with her 3 sons, an image of inner peace. Mao wears an expression of quiet determination and aloofness. Unlike his 2 brothers, who are clad in farmers' garments and looked like gauche peasants, he has an air of grace in his long gown, the traditional attire for scholars and gentry. In Mao's relationship with his mother, while she seems to have shown unconditional love and indulgence for him, his treatment of her combined strong feelings with selfishness. In later life, he told one of his closest staff a revealing story. "When my mother was dying, I told her I could not bear to see her looking in agony. I wanted to keep a beautiful image of her, and told her I wanted to stay away for a while. My mother was a very understanding person, and she agreed. So, the image of my mother in my mind has always been, and still is today, a healthy and beautiful one." On her deathbed, the person who took priority in Mao's consideration was himself, not his mother, nor did he hesitate to say so. Less surprisingly, Mao treated his dying father coldly. Chang died from typhoid on 23 January 1920, and before his death he longed to see his eldest son, but Mao stayed away and showed no feeling of sadness for him. In an article written on 21 November 1919, shortly after his mother's death, and entitled On Women's Independence, Mao claimed that women can do as much physical labor as men. It's just that they can't do such work during childbirth. So his answer to women's independence was that women should prepare enough before they marry so as to support themselves, and even that women should stockpile necessities for the period of childbirth themselves. Evidently, as a man, Mao did not want to have to look after women. He wanted no responsibility towards them. Moreover, his insistence that women could manage the same kind of manual labor as men, which went against obvious reality, showed he felt little tenderness towards them. When he came to power, the core of his approach to women was to put them to heavy manual labor. In 1951, he penned his first inscription for Women's Day, which went, "Unite to take part in production." At the end of 1919, radical students and teachers in Hunan started a drive to oust the provincial warlord governor, whose name was Chang Yao. Mao went with the delegation to lobby the central government in Peking, writing petitions and pamphlets on an altar in a Tibetan temple where he was staying. Although the delegation failed to achieve its goal, Mao was able, as a leading Hunan radical, to meet some famous personalities, including Hu Shi, a brilliant liberal figure, and Li Ta-chao, a prominent Marxist. But it was on his way back via Shanghai that Mao had the crucial encounter that was to change his life. In June 1920, he called on a Professor Chen Tu-Siu, at the time China's foremost Marxist intellectual, who was in the midst of forming a Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Mao had written a long article calling him a bright star in the world of thought. Aged 40, Chen was the undisputed leader of Chinese Marxists, a true believer, charismatic, with a volatile temper. The idea of forming this Communist Party did not stem from the professor, nor from any other Chinese. It originated in Moscow. In 1919, the new Soviet government had set up the Communist International, the Comintern, to foment revolution and influence policy in Moscow's interest around the world. In August, Moscow launched a huge secret program of action and subversion for China, starting a commitment of money, men, and arms 3 decades long, which culminated in bringing the Communists under Mao to power in 1949, Soviet Russia's most lasting triumph in foreign policy. In January 1920, the Bolsheviks took central Siberia and established an overland link with China. The Comintern sent a representative, Grigory Voitinsky, to China in April. In May, it established a center in Shanghai, with a view, as another agent reported to Moscow, of constructing a Chinese party. Voitinsky then proposed to Professor Chen that a communist party be set up. By June, Voitinsky was reporting home that Chen was to be made party secretary, i.e. the head, and was contacting revolutionaries in various cities. This was exactly when Mao showed up on Chen's doorstep. He had chanced upon the emergence of the CCP. Mao was not invited to be one of the founders, nor, it seems, was he told it was about to be formed. The 8 or so founding members were all eminent Marxists, and Mao had not yet even said that he believed in Marxism. The party was founded in August, after Mao had left Shanghai. This has been a delicate point for Mao and his successors, and as a result, official history dates the founding of the party to 1921, as that was the first time Mao could verifiably be located at a party conclave, the First Congress. This is duly commemorated with a museum in Shanghai, which enshrines the myth that Mao was a founding member of the party. That the party was founded in 1920, not 1921, is confirmed both by the official magazine of the Comintern and by one of the Moscow emissaries who organized the First Congress. But although not one of the founders, Mao was in the immediate outer ring. Professor Chang gave him the assignment of opening a bookshop in Changsha to sell party literature. The professor was in the middle of making his influential monthly, New Youth, the voice of the party. The July issue carried write-ups about Lenin and the Soviet government. From that autumn, the magazine was subsidized by the Comintern. Mao's job was to distribute New Youth and other communist publications, as well as selling other books and journals. Though not a committed communist, Mao was a radical. He also loved books and welcomed a job. Soon after he returned to Changsha, an advertisement issued about the bookshop contained the bizarre declaration, penned by himself, that "There is no new culture in the entire world. Only a little flower of new culture has been discovered in Russia on the shores of the Arctic Ocean." The bookshop immediately placed an order for 165 copies of the July issue of New Youth, by far its biggest order. Another large order, 130 copies, was for Labor World, a new party journal for workers. Most other journals the bookshop ordered were radical and pro-Russia. Mao was not risking his neck by undertaking pro-communist activities, which were not a crime. For now, communist Russia was actually in vogue. In Changsha, a Russia Study Society was being founded, with no less a personage than the county chief as its head. Russia's popularity was in large part due to a fraud perpetrated by the new Bolshevik government, the claim that it was renouncing the old Tsarist privileges and territory in China, when in fact it retained them. Russian-controlled territory covered over 250,000 acres and constituted the largest foreign concession in the country. Mao was in charge of the bookshop, but he got a friend to run it. An important trait emerged at this time. He had a gift for delegating chores and spotting the people to perform them. Mao gave himself the title of Special Liaison Man, soliciting donations from the wealthy and dealing with publishers, libraries, universities, and leading intellectuals all over the country. Professor Chang and a number of luminaries were listed as guarantors for the bookshop, which hugely boosted Mao's status and helped him to win a creditable post as headmaster of the primary school attached to his old college. There is no evidence that Mao formally joined the party now, although by November, thanks to the bookshop, he counted as one of us. When Moscow decided to set up an organization in Hunan called the Socialist Youth League to create a pool of potential party members, Mao was contacted to do the job. The following month, in a letter to friends in France, he declared that he deeply agreed with the idea of using the Russian model to reform China and the world. This was his first expression of communist belief. Approaching 27, Mao had become a communist, not after an idealistic journey or driven by passionate belief, but by being at the right place at the right time and being given a job that was highly congenial to him. He had effectively been incorporated into an expanding organization. His best friend at the time, Xiao Yu, thought the cost of the Russian way was too high and wrote to Mao from France, saying what he and some others felt. "We don't think some human beings should be sacrificed for the welfare of the majority. We are in favor of a moderate revolution, through education and seeking the welfare of all. We regard Russian-style, Marxist revolutions as ethically wrong." Mao summed up their approach as using peaceful means to seek the happiness of all. He argued against it, not on idealistic grounds, but invoking sheer realism. "I have two comments. All very well in theory, but can't be done in practice. Ideals are important," said Mao, "but reality is even more important. Mao was no fervent believer. This absence of heartfelt commitment would result in a most unconventional and unusual relationship with his party throughout his life, even when he was the head of that party. Chapter 3. Lukewarm Believer, 1920 to 1925, age 26 to 31. At the same time as Mao became involved with the Communist Party, he developed a relationship with the daughter of his former teacher, Yang Chang-chi. Yang Kaihui, 8 years Mao's junior, was to become his second wife. She was born in 1901 in an idyllic spot outside Changsha. A delicate and sensitive child, she was brought up by her mother, who came from a scholar's family, while her father spent 11 years abroad, in Japan, Britain, and Germany, studying ethics, logic, and philosophy. When he returned to Changsha in spring 1913, he brought back European ways and encouraged his daughter to join him and his male students at meals, which was unheard of in those days. Beautiful, elegant, wistful, and articulate, she bowled over all the young men. Her father was impressed with Mao's brains and gave him high recommendations to influential people. "I am telling you seriously," he wrote to one of them. "These two people, Mao and another student, Kai Hessen, are rare talents in China and will have a great future. You cannot but pay serious attention to them." When he became a professor of ethics at Peking University in 1918, he welcomed Mao to stay with his family during Mao's first and fruitless venture to Peking. Kaihui was then 17, and Mao was very keen on her, but she did not respond. She wrote years later, "When I was about 17 or 18, I began to have my own views about marriage. I was against any marriage that involved rituals. I also thought that to seek love deliberately would easily and inevitably lose true, sacred, incredible, the highest, the most beautiful, and unsurpassable love. There is an expression which best expressed my thoughts. Not to have, if not perfect." In January 1920, her father died. Mao was in Peking on his second trip and spent a lot of time with the family. It was then that she fell in love with Mao. She was to write, "Father died. My beloved father died. Of course I was very sad, but I felt death was also a relief for father, and so I was not too sad. But I did not expect to be so lucky. I had a man I loved. I really loved him so much. I had been in love with him after I had heard a lot about him, and had read many of his articles and diaries. Although I loved him, I would not show it. I was convinced that love was in the hands of nature, and I must not presumptuously demand or pursue it." So she still held back. Then they were parted, when Kaihui escorted her father's coffin back to Changsha, where she entered a missionary school. The distance only heightened her feelings. She later recalled, "He wrote me many letters, expressing his love. Still, I did not dare to believe I had such luck. If it had not been for a friend who knew his, Mao's, feelings and told me about them, saying that he was very miserable because of me, I believe I would have remained single all my life. Ever since I came to know his true feelings towards me completely, from that day on, I had a new sense. I felt that apart from living for my mother, I was also living for him. I was imagining that if there were a day when he died, and when my mother was also no longer with me, I would definitely follow him and die with him." At the time of Mao's second marriage, Moscow was stepping up its efforts to foment subversion in China. It began secretly training a Chinese army in Siberia and explored armed intervention in China, as it had just attempted unsuccessfully in Poland. Simultaneously, it was building up one of its largest intelligence networks anywhere in the world, with a KGB station already established in Shanghai and numerous agents, both civilian and military, GRU, in other key cities, including Canton and, of course, Peking. On 3 June 1921, new top-level Moscow representatives arrived, both under pseudonyms, a Russian military intelligence man called Nikolsky and a Dutchman called Maring, who had been an agitator in the Dutch East Indies. These two agents told the CCP members in Shanghai to call a congress to formalize the party. Letters went out to 7 regions where contacts had been established, asking each to send 2 delegates, and enclosing 200 yuan to each place to cover travel to Shanghai. One lot of invitations and money came to Mao in Changsha. 200 yuan was the equivalent of nearly 2 years' salary from his teaching job, and far more than the trip could require. It was Mao's first known cash payment from Moscow. He chose as his co-delegate a 45-year-old friend called Ho Shuhang. They left quite secretively on the evening of 29 June in a small steamboat under a stormy sky, declining the offers of friends to see them off. Although there was no law against communist activities, they had reason to keep their heads down, as what they were engaged in was a conspiracy, collusion to establish an organization set up with foreign funding, with the aim of seizing power by illegal means. The CCP's first Congress opened in Shanghai on 23 July 1921, attended by 13 people, all journalists, students, or teachers, representing a total of 57 communists, mostly in similar occupations. Not one was a worker. Neither of the party's 2 most prestigious members, Professors Li Ta-Chao and Chen Tu-Siu, was present, even though the latter had been designated the party chief. The 2 Moscow emissaries ran the show. Maring, tall and mustachioed, made the opening speech in English, translated by one of the delegates. Participants seemed to recall its length, several hours, more than its content. Long speeches were rare in China at the time. Nikolsky was remembered as the one who made the short speech. The presence of the foreigners and the control they exercised at once became an issue. The chair was allotted to one Chang Ku-Tao, later Mao's major challenger, because he had been to Russia and had links with the foreigners. One delegate recalled that Ku-Tao at one point proposed canceling the resolution of the previous evening. I confronted him. How is it that a resolution passed by the meeting could be cancelled just like that? He said it was the view of the Russian representatives. I was extremely angry. So we don't need to have meetings. We just have orders from the Russians. The protest was in vain. Another delegate suggested that before they went along with the Russian plans, they should investigate whether Bolshevism actually worked, and proposed sending one mission to Russia and one to Germany, a proposal that alarmed Moscow's men and was duly rejected. Mao spoke little and made little impact. Compared with delegates from the larger cities, he was something of a provincial, clad in a traditional cotton gown and black cotton shoes, rather than a European-style suit, the attire of many young progressives. He did not strive to impress, and was content mainly to listen. The meeting had started in a house in the French settlement, and the police in those enclaves, known as concessions, were vigilant about communist activities. On the evening of 30 July, a stranger barged in, and Maring, smelling a police spy, ordered the delegates to leave. The Chinese participants adjourned to a small town outside Shanghai called Jiaxing, on a lake strewn with water chestnuts. Moscow's men stayed away from this final session for fear of attracting attention. The wife of a Shanghai delegate hailed from the lakeside town, and she rented a pleasure boat in which the delegates sat at a polished table where food, drinks, and mahjong sets had been laid. A thick carved wooden screen separated this inner chamber from the open but sheltered front of the boat, where the delegate's wife sat with her back against the screen. She told us how, when other boats passed, she would tap on the screen with her fan, and inside the mahjong tiles would click loudly as they were shuffled. Soon it started to pour, and the boat was enveloped in rain. In this dramatic setting, the Chinese Communist Party was proclaimed, somewhat inconclusively, as without Moscow's men present, no program could be finalized. The Congress did not even issue a manifesto or charter. The delegates were given another 50 yuan each as return fare. This enabled Mao to go off and do some sightseeing, in comfort, in Hangzhou and Nanjing, where he saw his girlfriend, Jung, again. Jung was to die of illness in 1931. Dependence on Moscow, and Moscow's money, remained a sore point for many in the party. Professor Chen, who came to Shanghai in late August to take up the post of secretary, informed his comrades, "If we take their money, we have to take their orders." He proposed, in vain, that none of them should be full-time professional revolutionaries, but instead should have independent jobs and use them to spread the ideas of revolution. Chen argued vehemently with Maring about the latter's insistence that the CCP was automatically a branch of the Comintern, and particularly over the notion that Nikolsky had to supervise all their meetings. "Do we have to be controlled like this?" he would shout. "It simply isn't worth it." Often, he would refuse to see Maring for weeks running. Chen would yell, bang his palm on the table, and even throw teacups around. Maring's nickname for him was the Volcano. On the frequent occasions when Chen exploded, Maring would go next door to have a smoke, while Chen tried to simmer down. But without Moscow's funding, the CCP could not even begin to carry out any activities such as publishing communist literature and organizing a labor movement. Over a 9-month period, October 1921 to June 1922, out of its expenditure of 17,655 yuan, less than 6% was raised inside China, while over 94% came from the Russians, as Chen himself reported to Moscow. Indeed, there were many other communist groups in China at the time, at least 7 between 1920 and 1922, one claiming as many as 11,000 members. But without Russian funds, they all collapsed. Unlike Chen, Mao showed no qualms about taking Moscow's money. He was a realist. Russian funding also transformed his life. After the Congress, he began to receive 60 to 70 yuan a month from the party for the Hunan branch, soon increased to 100, and then 160 to 170. This large and regular income made a tremendous difference. Mao had always been short of money. He had 2 jobs, headmaster and small-time journalist, and he dreaded having to depend on these 2 occupations to make his living. In 2 letters written in late November 1920 to a friend, he had complained bitterly, saying, "A life just using the mouth and brain is misery to the extreme. I often go without a rest for 3 or 4 hours, even working into the night. My life is really too hard."
End of Disc 1.